With the arrival of Season 2 of Rings of Power, one scene in particular seems to have caused much confusion and consternation among the viewing public.
Safe here. We have a home. Must we go to war again?
The scene has raised many questions and inspired much debate among Tolkien fans. Do orcs fuck? Are there orc women? Do they make babies? Are orcs inherently evil or can they be redeemed? The answers to these questions, like many things in Tolkien's mythos, aren't exactly cut and dry. Like many, my most immediate recollection of the orc reproductive cycle was of Uruk-hai emerging from some sort of mud placenta in the film adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring. Putting aside for a moment the distinction between orcs and Uruk-hai, this concept does seem to have some origin in earlier iterations of Tolkien's mythos, in which orcs were described as being made of stone, bred from subterranean heat and slime. Later, however, Tolkien would come up with a different origin for the orcs in a passage in the Silmarillion, describing them as corrupted elves. In this same passage, he would also divulge a bit about orc baby making. For the orca had life and multiplied after the manner of the children of Ilúvatar, and not that had life of its own, nor the semblance of life could ever Melkor make, since his rebellion in the Ainindale before the beginning, so say the wise. Okay, so it seems orcs do indeed mate and reproduce in the traditional sense, so Rings of Power is right on that account. But note that caveat there at the end of the passage in the Silmarillion, so say the wise. This renders the backstory of the orcs as anecdotal. Sure, this explanation for the orcs comes on good authority, it comes from the wise, but it isn't ironclad. This was very deliberate by Tolkien. Meanwhile, on the subject of orc women, Tolkien writes in a letter to one Mrs. Munby, there must have been orc women, but in stories that seldom, if ever, see the orcs except as soldiers of armies in the service of the evil lords, we naturally would not learn much about their lives. Not much was known. Now we can quibble about how much canonical authority these letters might have, but notice that even here, Tolkien leaves room for ambiguity. Probably the most contentious thing about this scene in Rings of Power, though, isn't whether orcs fuck or not. It isn't to do with orc women, it's do orcs, or did they at one time, organize themselves into these cute little family units? Would these marauding killing machines have such thoughtful reservations about going off to war? Are orcs inherently evil? Is this a question of nature versus nurture? Again, Tolkien himself seems to have left room for ambiguity when trying to divine the moral totality of the orcs. A better question than are orcs inherently evil is maybe what does evil mean to Tolkien? Is evil the absence or the inability for good, or do good and evil exist alongside each other, with evil being something that must be continually resisted? Tolkien's mythos is of course a story of the latter. It's a story about temptation, where to do or to be good is an act of consistent willful sacrifice. Frodo, Sam, Aragorn, Boromir, Gandalf, Arwen, each of them is willing to sacrifice something. Good and evil, then, are a deliberate choice. Evil is greed, jealousy, spite, hubris. It's the opposite of sacrifice. Even Sauron or Morgoth, who we might consider, at least metaphorically, the metaphysical renditions of evil from which all other evils in the story are derived, even they are still motivated by a familiar earthly morality. They are evil by choice. Returning to the subject of orcs, Tolkien scholar Tom Shippey posits orcs as sharing the human concept of good and evil with a familiar sense of morality, though he notes that, like many people, orcs are quite unable to apply their morals to themselves. In his view, Tolkien, as a Catholic, took it as a given that evil cannot make, only mock, so orcs could not have an equal and opposite morality to that of men or elves. In a 1954 letter, Tolkien wrote that orcs were fundamentally a race of rational incarnate creatures creatures, though horribly corrupted, if no more so than many men to be met today. So following this train of thought, maybe after all the fighting is over and Sauron's evil spirit has been well and truly scattered to the wind, orcs, as a corrupted, fallen people, in keeping with the Catholic moral framework, might find their way back toward the light, back toward redemption. Either that, or maybe they just retreat underground, fight amongst themselves for a while, then eventually fade away. None of this is certain. What is certain, however, is the narrative and thematic purpose of orcs as Tolkien wrote them during the Second and Third Ages of Middle-earth. Orcs are essentially the avatars of sin, the agents of the moral rot that must be overcome if anything or anyone is to be saved or redeemed in the first place. Orcs are the engines of industrialization, the anonymous, unthinking march of progress over the natural world. Tolkien did humanize his orcs to some extent, and some of the orcs in Peter Jackson's films certainly have a certain charisma about them.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys!
But none of it was ever so much that it broke their central conceit. What happens when you go so far out of your way to make orcs sympathetic, when you lean so clumsily into moral relativism, is you introduce the suggestion that maybe there's actually much less sin to forgive, that maybe neither orcs nor anyone else need to be redeemed because really they were never that bad in the first place. And maybe the unflinching march of industrialization isn't so bad as long as it's for a good cause. Everything is weakened, everything is watered down. The orcs in Rings of Power are essentially just like Boromir now. They've turned bloodthirsty and cruel not by unchecked avarice, gluttony, and malice, but because they want to protect their home, and because they have families to fight for. Even still, none of this really gets to the heart of why this scene in Rings of Power just doesn't really work, or why the whole idea of expanding Tolkien's mythos in the first place is a pitfall unto itself. The truth is, you're not supposed to get too in the weeds about too much of Tolkien's mythos. You're not supposed to know too many things for sure one way or the other. You're not supposed to know the moral totality of orcs. You're not supposed to know for sure whether they fuck or not, or what orc women get up to, or when, if ever, there might be heckin' wholesome orc families who just want to be left alone with their orc babies. What you're meant to do is to speculate on these things. You're meant to ask questions, not necessarily to find all the answers. Speculation isn't a flaw. It isn't a shortcoming of the author or their work. It's a part of the artistic process. It's part of the appeal. A good author invites speculation from their audience. As detailed or as well realized as Tolkien's world building might be, there are still some things that you, the audience, and even Tolkien himself aren't really supposed to know for sure. As Tolkien himself writes, there is of course a clash between literary technique and the fascination of elaborating in detail an imaginary mythical age. Mythical, not allegorical. My mind does not work allegorically. As a story, I think it is good that there should be a lot of things unexplained, especially if an explanation actually exists, and I have perhaps from this point of view erred in trying to explain too much and give too much past history. One of the strengths of a good storyteller is knowing where to apply weight and focus in a narrative. Every storyteller makes a decision about which parts of a story should be given more weight than others, which elements deserve more or less focus. Where one writer might stumble upon an idea or a necessary plot point and find it deserving of 2 or 3 pages, another might compress that information into a single paragraph. In Tolkien's case, he might tuck that information away in the appendices. A storyteller decides which characters belong at the forefront and which belong at the periphery. These decisions and more are often made with a consideration for pacing, tone, clarity, and theme in mind, all of which are just as important in world building as any map, bestiary, or family tree. And therein lies the problem with all these attempts at expanding Tolkien's universe, is that in scouring over every monetizable crumb of lore to plaster on the big and small screen, every other artistic consideration the author made gets trampled on in the process. Not only that, but the expanded universe increasingly squashes every opportunity for speculation. To reference a tried and true meme, there's a reason why we don't know Aragorn's tax policy. There's a reason why we don't see the day-to-day struggles of a king dealing with the realities of class, of economics, and of every other sordid dispute that might happen in Gondor. One story, the one that Tolkien wrote, is the story of a good man who becomes king. The other is the story of a beleaguered politician. One has a certain mythic, aspirational quality, the other is stiflingly mundane and material. Again, we can certainly speculate on Aragorn's tax policy. We can look at Aragorn's rugged, humble beginnings as a ranger, at his virtue and his wisdom, and we can reasonably infer that his tax policy, assuming there is one, is probably pretty fair and reasonable. The way that some people talk about Tolkien's mythos, it's as if the author has created an unlimited sandbox for the benefit of others, a sort of artistic co-op waiting for other people to come along and put their stamp on it. There seems to be this suggestion that some of it might be unfinished, fertile ground for equal or maybe even better minds to guide toward a better, more modern ideal. All the expanded universe ends up becoming then is an exercise in control. Control over the Lord of the Rings is wrested from both the audience and its original author and into the hands of fly-by-night corporate stooges. Where before the mystery of the Entwives was left up to your imagination, here comes Amazon to replace your imagination with their own. Where before Aragorn's hunt for Gollum was only a single paragraph in the appendices to again be left up to the imagination, here comes Warner Brothers to make it into a feature-length movie. As much as I and everyone else love Peter Jackson's film trilogy, you could, to some extent, point to them as being part of the same process, as evidenced by the fact that the first thing everyone thought of when it comes to orc reproduction was from the films, or how the upcoming War of the Rohirrim, which you would think would have the best opportunity to try something new, plants itself firmly within the universe of the films. In 2012, Christopher Tolkien had this to say about the film adaptations of his father's story. Tolkien has become a monster, devoured by his own popularity and absorbed into the absurdity of our time. The chasm between the beauty and seriousness of the work and what it has become has overwhelmed me. The commercialization has reduced the aesthetic and philosophical impact of the creation to nothing. There is only one solution for me: to turn my head away. They eviscerated the book by making it an action movie for young people aged 15 to 25. While I don't agree with Christopher Tolkien's assessment of the films themselves, I do think he might have been onto something. Middle-earth seems to be straying further and further from the thing it was in the first place. Christopher Tolkien is dead, and the stewardship of his father's works has trickled down to an ever more nebulously defined estate. The creatives in charge of these projects operate from moral sensibilities increasingly at odds with Tolkien, under the guidance of corporate entities which only become bigger and more voracious with each passing year. Like the orcs themselves, I'm not saying these projects can never be good, only that the mold in which they're made is so twisted and corrupt it's going to be an uphill battle. Okay, here's where I ruin the whole thing by saying I kind of have a soft spot for the Shadow of Mordor video games and the way the orcs are depicted there. Really, you can get away with a lot if you just make it cool and fun and not lame and gay.